Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture. A note about this episode. You'll hear me refer to the subject item as a cameo more than once during the conversation, even getting my guest to use the term, instead of her more accurate description of a profile portrait. Cameos are usually jewelry with embossed faces, while this item is a silhouette portrait. Now, with this correction in mind, let's hear what this piece can tell us about time and place.
I think one of the really interesting things, especially when we're contrasting the Revolutionary War, which certainly has things commemorating it, but it is, things printed, people's letters, things like that. It's really interesting to see at the Civil War, you're talking about technologies and what's available to them of immediately commemorating things on a national level. Yeah. Not only the photography, but we get posters and newspapers and coins and medals and everything from Elmer Ellsworth, who's kind of considered the first conspicuous death of the Union, going down with his Zouave unit to Alexandria, Virginia, and taking down the Confederate flag from the tavern and then getting shot by the irate tavern owner. It's this incredible, out of a movie story that immediately people are like, Elmer Ellsworth on everything.
Yeah.
And you can collect Elmer Ellsworth stuff that dates from weeks after or days after he died.
I think it has so much to do with the fact that they were fighting for the very thing that the Revolutionary era had created.
Yeah.
Right? So, those revolutionaries that founded the country, while they didn't necessarily do it all themselves, they set it up so that it would develop its own infrastructure, it would develop its own culture, it would develop its own identity and politics and everything in society, really. And so by the time you get to 1861, there's, especially in the North, an actual national culture happening.
Yes.
And so they see that as we're protecting the Union.
Yeah, and you see that reflected in the soldier letters all the time. It's really interesting. These young guys would write home about why they were fighting. And more often than not, it is explicitly to preserve the Union. There's kind of the other side of that is sometimes they're very explicitly saying, I'm not fighting for slavery. I don't care, which is another thing to confront. But they are very explicitly fighting for a patriotic cause. They believe in the Constitution. They believe in the Union. And that's why they're down in Virginia at a camp.
Well, because if nothing else, you can't solve the other problems without an intact country.
Exactly.
Right? So if you're going to confront larger issues and rapidly bring the country up to the same speed as the rest of the world when it comes to topics like slavery.
Yeah.
You can't do that with a country. Now, do you ascribe to the idea that the Civil War was going to happen, that it was inevitable?
Yeah, I do. I was just talking with a dealer about I'm really interested in kind of the periods of history nobody teaches, the period between the Revolution and the Civil War. that's where the Civil War was born, right? This is
I
where,
love that era, by the way.
You talk to real history people,
I'm an Erie Canal lover of the Erie Canal. That's all I care about.
So I'm fascinated in this period, and I'm fascinated in the Mexican-American War because, first of all, you've got all the same half the guys who are the leaders of the Civil War.
Right.
They cut their teeth in the Mexican-American War. That's Grant was there, Lee was there. That's where they all kind of started.
Franklin Pierce was there.
Right out of Winfield Scott. All of these guys right out of West Point. Some of them young guys, some of them were commanders. But so you have these characters that show up in the Civil War, but it's that victory there that opens up the West, and it really this simmering question of slavery was always there, but now it becomes the pedal is to the metal of expansion, and new states are being added, and it becomes not a philosophical debate about slavery that exists already in a state. It is, we have a new state.
Yeah.
What happens? And you have two sides with very, very strongly held beliefs over what that should look like. And so, you get Kansas, Missouri, you get Bleeding Kansas, and that, I think, is, some people even claim that that's when the Civil War really started.
Yeah.
I think that's a little far, but I think it's the prelude for sure. John Brown. And
you have that mural that's, speaking of commemoration, right? You have that mural in the Kansas State House.
Yeah.
Which is in every textbook in the country.
It's wild.
And I think it was a New Deal
it was, I think so.
Funded thing. And it has, talk about a wild thing to have in your State House. But you have this, fire and brimstone, John Brown, Alpha, Omega, rifle in one hand, Bible in the other.
Fringe jacket and just,
But they put the Union and Confederate dead at his feet.
Yeah.
Right? So that's 1930s. In the 1930s, there's still Civil War veterans. They're very old, but
and that's
still
really
alive.
The beginning of the Lost Cause as really taking over as a philosophical idea of commemorating the Civil War.
I think about Gettysburg nightly. No, just
I do.
right before bed. Well, in a way, so I think about Gettysburg a lot. I love visiting there. I'll tell you a crazy story about it after we're done here, but I just all of those memorials and monuments there.
Yeah.
They didn't show up all at one time.
No.
And you can mark the changes in attitudes about not only that battle but the war itself as time goes on.
Yeah.
A lot of the earliest ones, of course, they're mostly northern because they still had money after the war, and so they're putting up things earlier, not super early, but earlier than the former Confederate states. And a lot of them very simple, very obelisks and stuff like that. You move ahead to, Alabama's statue at the Pickett's Charge line, or Florida, and
the so-called high water mark,
right? But on the other side, as they're waiting to. Elaborate, very fanciful, because they're from the 50s and the 60s, the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like as you go through Gettysburg, it's not only the history of a 3-day-long battle, but it's also the history of, about 100 years of commemorating and deciding how to make it look. You have and I'm curious if you have a perspective on this, the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which was dedicated by President Roosevelt in 1938, 37, whatever, 38, because it was the 75th anniversary of the battle. It's a beautiful monument. I love the idea of it. It's all about peace between the sections, right? It's in a weird spot of the battlefield. It's over on the first day's battle. Do you think there's any reason for that? Just real estate? Or?
Maybe it was real estate because, by that point, there's a lot
pretty
of
crowded,
monuments up at that point. So many going up in the 19th century, but I feel like every time there's tons in that first, decade of the 20th century. That's a fascinating, because day one, it is the invasion of the North. This is Lee's. This is the push to take war to the North.
So that's when the armies meet, and therefore that's the That's the flame.
And I mean, that's like this, it's interesting that it's the first day of saying maybe the battle shouldn't have happened. Or, of course, from a pacifist standpoint, of course, no war. But at the same time, going back to your question about was a civil war inevitable, I think it was. And I think, of all the wars, one to end slavery it's a pretty good reason to fight for the end of enslavement. But the commemoration on day one of Gettysburg, maybe there's connections trying to be made with Lincoln as the Gettysburg Address and connections to other commemorations. But
well, now that you mention that, I'm curious because it's not the extreme other side, but there is a memorial in the cemetery where he gave that speech. Mm-hmm. Man, we're getting into some like Dan Brown type stuff now, with because that would kind of bookend. Oh wow, that might be there. Okay,
so maybe that's more of what's going.
Because I'm not only a big subscriber to the idea that monuments and memorials are primary sources. They tell you more, or at least just as much, about the people who put them up as it does about the past.
Yeah.
But I think placement of things has a lot to do with it too.
Yeah.
And as far as communicating an idea.
Yeah.
And because at the high water mark, that would be another good example of a place to put it.
It would.
They do have a monument there, but maybe.
But it was also really taken. I literally just the other day cataloged a commemorative medal. It was 1920s, I want to say, and I think it was when that monument was put in, high water mark, and it is very much from more of a Southern perspective of saying this was the high water mark of the Confederacy. This is the farthest the Confederacy.
The lost cause.
Yeah, it's very lost cause. It's very into that. So it's interesting if that would have predated the Roosevelt monument, but.
It's so funny how you can, not funny, haha, but just like interesting. You can trace American history from 1863 to present at one place. Yeah. And anything connected to it.
Yeah.
I have volumes of books about Gettysburg. I've long been a student of that battle more than the war.
Yeah.
I was just enthralled by Gettysburg, and I remember, just the first time I ever went there. All right, I'll tell the story now because it's on the air.
Yeah.
So I was working, this is good for an ephemera fair, I was working at a post office in Plattsburgh, New York.
Okay.
Also a burg that ends with a H.
The big War of 1812 town.
Right, I'm glad somebody knows that, right? So, and we could talk about the monument there. They have a couple monuments to that battle there. So I was working in the processing center so it wasn't just a regular post office where all the mail's coming in. The shift I worked on was outgoing mail, so stuff from the city heading other places. And I was working on the canceling machine. So part of my job was to make sure anything that fell out, to put it back in. We were allowed to listen to music, but just one headphone on.
Okay.
And because I am who I am, I was listening to Johnny Cash's America, by Word and Song.
Nice.
Where he reads the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
So I'm listening to Johnny Cash give the Gettysburg Address, like the coolest person around, and out flutters this postcard, and it's the picture side is down.
Yeah.
I pick it up. Guess what it is? It's a painting of Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address.
No way.
I was all color left my face.
I have some shivers here.
Right?
That story.
And I was
That's amazing.
Oh, and I was like, oh my God. And I had nobody to tell it to though, because all the other people working with me would have
been like, who,
so,
what?
Why are you listening to Johnny Cash read the Gettysburg Address? And so I kept that story with me for a while. And there's a radio program called the AM Coast to Coast.
Oh yeah.
I know
Coast
Art
to Coast.
Bell.
Art Bell, R.I.P. buddy.
Who's the guy that took over from George Norrie? So George Norrie, one night I called him up with that story.
Yeah.
And I told the call screener, and the call screener like paused after I told him. He's like, "Oh man, that's freaky." And I'm like, "I just freaked you out." Like,
you got the coast to coast guys. That's
ghosts flying UFOs around, and I'm like, okay, and so my question for him as I was telling the story on the air, I'm like, because I had yet to been to Gettysburg.
Yeah.
I'm like, is this a warning? Is this an omen? Am I going to go there and either die immediately, or am I going to find like buried treasure if I, and he was like, I think it's okay. And of course I went, nothing happened, but it was just like, I have this, and that was years after I'd already become a huge fan.
Yeah.
But I just love that kind of coincidence.
That is an amazing coincidence. And like, you're talking about Gettysburg, and Gettysburg being like, you're so into Gettysburg more so than anything else. And I think it's interesting that I think a lot of people feel that way. And it is such this pivotal battle, and it is this, invasion of the North. But it like looking back at our National Civil War Wax Museum thing, I was looking through, and there's stuff from the whole war. And it's interesting that I think Gettysburg as a place of commemoration has kind of become the Civil War place, which is not to say that there aren't other battlefields and memorials and museums and places where you can go, but Gettysburg is like the spot. That's the battlefield you go to. That's the one you force your kids to drive around.
If you're going to teach the Civil War, this is the place to do it. This is the one.
And so it's interesting that it's not just a Gettysburg Wax Museum. It's a whole Civil War Wax Museum. I mean, the cover image is, Lincoln and Mary Todd with Booth there. In the background.
I think it is actually still there.
Because a lot of the wax museums, some of them they closed up, some of the ones.
I know that the Visitors Center, which is built around the same time and had that same mid-century look to it, burned down.
Yeah, it did.
It was like soon after I last was there.
Yeah.
I kind of wish I had taken some pictures of it. It wasn't me. And the building across the street had a car. Like Gettysburg's kind of lost its veneer, like I said. It doesn't have that same draw it once did. It's always weird when you're there and there's like stuff that has nothing to do with the Civil War in town.
Yeah.
Like comic books. I'm like, I know people got to live their lives, but like, why would you live here if you weren't all about Gettysburg? Or the other way, where it's like they used to have General Pickett's buffet, which was kind of weird.
Like if you want a haunting, I think General Pickett might come after you for that one.
Maybe he's the maitre d'. He brings you to your table. He's like, oh, I'll charge you this way, so
we'll have some ghostly mac and cheese.
Imagine. We should reopen that restaurant. I don't think it was there last time I was. But I mean, like, and so it's like modernity on top of, this battlefield. And I remember talking, because I lived for a time in Oswego. I went to school in Oswego, New York, and there was like, we're picking up a lot of that. It's an ephemera affair, so it fits, right?
Yeah.
And I did my project for school was to do some research. Actually, I lived across the street from a building called the Ladies' Home of Oswego.
Okay.
Which had opened in the 1870s as the home for the homeless.
Oh, wow.
And it was a community-supported, basically, old ladies' home.
Yeah.
And because Oswego, it was on the same level as Buffalo for a long time.
Okay.
But then, and this is my research kind of discovered this, I made the conclusion that when the toll was lifted on the Erie Canal, because cargo used to avoid the toll, they would cut off and go through Oswego, get on the Great Lakes there instead of going all the way to Buffalo.
Gotcha.
So once the toll for New York State was dropped,
they were like,
they said we can afford to continue. So Buffalo continued to grow, Oswego just dropped down.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the people left Oswego, but they left Grandma behind. And so they're like, well, you got to live here. And
wow.
I was like, I feel like the kid in Never-Ending Story, because I'd go up every weekend to their attic, and they had all these books and records and just ephemera for me to go through.
That's amazing.
It was awesome. And this one book, oh my God, it was incredible. It was a biography of all of the original residents.
Oh, wow.
And one of them was from the Netherlands, the Netherlands or Germany, and her husband. They arrived, and it said it was so recent after the Civil War, they didn't even mention it. They didn't call it the Civil War. They didn't call it the War of the Rebellion. They just called it the war.
Yeah.
Instead of the last war.
Or the late war, yeah.
And they misspelled Gettysburg because he was killed at Gettysburg.
Oh, wow.
And, in fact, his entire unit, which down the street from where I lived and where this building was it was very small, very generic, modern, like modest, Civil War soldier with a mustache and the kepi pack and everything. And it was dedicated to his regiment, the 147th New York.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, the 147th.
They got wiped out. Right by where the Eternal Peace Light Monument is.
Yeah.
And you can find the Oswego Monument there. It has the same backpack that says Oswego on it. And I was just captivated with the story because I was like, she was the youngest one of all the women in the first grouping because she was an immigrant.
Yeah.
And her husband, I think he volunteered. I think it was a volunteer regiment, but I think it was high pressure to volunteer.
New York was really high pressure at that point because they had drafts and they had really high quotas to make, which gets into you get the riots in '63 too in New York City.
That unit was comprised almost entirely of German and Irish immigrants.
Yeah.
And so he and most of his unit got wiped out on that first day. Yeah. And so she's stranded.
She's like, great, I'm in Oswego.
Right.
What do I do?
Just get covered in snow. And so she ends up at this home. But I'm like, and there was another woman in there who was a telegraph operator during the Great Chicago Fire. Yeah. And I mean, I was just like reading. Yeah. And it was like, these stories are so incredible. And I don't know where I'm going with it now, but I guess... And because I got so swept up in her story and her husband's story that I'm like, I got to go back to Oswego. But it was like the most amazing block in the entire city because right down the street from there was the Oswego Historical Society building, ran by one of the coolest historians I've ever known, one of the most realistic guys. He would have just got really mad at me for saying one of the first. He's like, it's either your first or you're not. There's no such thing as one of the first. He had on his shelf in his office the Congressional Medal of Honor that was given to Mary Walker. Oh, wow. Posthumously. Yeah. Because she had been a surgeon during the Civil War and a spy for the Union. Yeah. And she was from there. Yeah. And so it was he had it. I'm like, oh, can I see it? He's like, oh, that one that's on display, that's the facsimile. This is the real one. He shows it to me. But he was telling me that when a lot of those veterans from that regiment, the ones who lived, went back, they were arguing with each other. No, we were over there. We were over there. I remember that hill. That's the hill we were on. Come to find out, that hill was not there at all in 1863. That it was
the imperfection of memory.
And it's like, but they're like, no. So it's like, even those monuments and memorials that scatter the ground there, I mean, they're general, no pun intended, but, like...
No, I mean, like, you talk about, like, even eyewitness accounts from 2 days after an event and the unreliability of them. So, and then asking war veterans who had seen the horrors of the battle. I mean, you're talking about the 147th New York. That's, there's got to be some untreated PTSD that they're probably dealing with, and then asking them to go back to the site of their battle and be like, where was it? I mean, you can't imagine necessarily the best accuracy, but it is really interesting about like the post-war era of everybody's kind of publishing regimental histories, biographies, sometimes memoirs and their own tale. Sometimes it's written by a son or a widow. But I mean, it's this great proliferation. But there's also some where it's like, I love reading the bibliographies of these. Like Nevins will really comment on, like, I had a pamphlet of a guy who supposedly had been held at Andersonville. And the bibliographer's like, there's no evidence this guy was born in Andersonville. So, I mean, there's sometimes invention, and then sometimes they're like, this doesn't match up with other people's accounts of things, or, from what we know of, like, all this other reports, this doesn't fit, or... sometimes they're like, yeah, no, this is super accurate. But, it's this memory as a living thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes being used. Sometimes, I think it's just, memory's imperfect, but sometimes a point is trying to be made by people, too.
Well, like we were saying before, it was a collective, traumatic event.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that, you could be untouched by it if you were hundreds of miles away.
Sure.
It always amazes
you occasionally
me.
Get some of these guys. I had a diary once of a guy who, the worst thing that happened to him was that he did get diarrhea at one point, but that was about as exciting as it got. But he formed a glee club in his regiment, and
they all
saw
did.
no major battles, but he got really into the glee club because there wasn't much else going on, and his diary is just filled with like, so and so didn't show up to practice today, like being really mad about his fellow glee clubbers.
I gotta say, why don't we have movies about that? Because, honestly, wouldn't it put a new perspective on that entire conflict and everything about it? And it's the same thing with other wars get similar treatment where there'll be a story being told that just, I guess Little Women would be kind of like that, where the war's going on, but it's not present in their everyday life.
And there's the even perspective.
Soldiering age, like Laurie is absolutely of age that he could go to war, but he's not.
Yeah.
Because he's a rich kid and, can just sit at home and study
and he's
and
in
stuff.
a state that's not forcing people into a draft at that point. So.
And even if they were, they would just go to Boston and get all the immigrants and, they wouldn't go to the suburbs and stuff. And it's like, it would be really, I don't want to say a comedy film, but, to kind of give it that, to flesh it out, because unfortunately, very few movies are going to be made out of boring things. Yeah. Right? You want action, you want to have a point, you want to do something great, but at some point or another, you need to have some kind of media that fills in the gaps and makes it clear to everybody. Just like, recently with the Los Angeles fires, from an outsider perspective and the way that media covers it, you would think that entire city was on fire. Yeah. And not just sections of a sprawling metropolis area that goes on for miles and miles and miles. Yeah. So it was a big deal, and of course the people who lost their homes and their livelihoods and their lives, awful, terrible, it may as well have been the end of the world. But the rest of the country, the rest of the world's like, oh, LA's gone. Yeah. And so same with the Civil War, it's like everybody was either killed or going to be killed every single day, and the reality is, like you said, there's plenty of people that were in uniform but never even did anything. Right.
There's on Garrison somewhere, and like that one guy, he just kind of like, they moved around. They were in the Eastern Theater, but managed to miss every battle.
We were late.
Like, it was one of those, like, some guys have all the luck. But then, the next letter you read, you're like, oh my God, like, he started at, the first Battle of Bull Run and goes all the way to, the Siege of Petersburg. And you're like, and every,
it's like the Forrest Gump of the Civil War,
Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, all of them, the Wilderness, Overland Campaign. You're like, you poor baby.
And then what must have happened to him after the war?
Yeah,
what must have been his perspective on things? They didn't have, I don't even think they called it shell shock. I don't think it was a World War II.
That was later, even though they had shells. You get these stories too. Going to this, you get these really tragic stories in the 1870s and 80s of guys trying to integrate back into society. They try out a few different careers, and trigger warning for people, but they end up taking their own lives. It's a very common story among these veterans, and it's the reporting is sometimes so insensitive too, because it's often accompanied by kind of like a mental breakdown or an episode of so and so went off and is lost and is manic, and and they don't write about it in sensitive terms. There's very little understanding of the mental health crises that these men were going through, and so you sometimes will get the newspaper or the obituary and so and so is literally they're just they're going crazy, and because there was you had the GAR units, there was a lot of veteran stuff, but at the same time there was not the mental health care for these men. So
they barely had regular health care, so they weren't about to move it up to their brains at all yet. I wonder if that sets the stage for the next generation, the generation after that, and their treatment of the war, because you end up with those who have no connection to it at all, as in they're like politicians or they were business people during the war, and then their kids or people that weren't old enough to serve and have that kind of like, they feel envious that they weren't able to do it. And because you can mark, just like on the battlefield of Gettysburg, you can mark throughout history attempts, both subtle and very overt, of trying to mend the two sides.
Yeah.
And to,
oh yeah.
I think about during the Spanish-American War, the two generals, they're both way too old to be leading anybody, but they give, I forget which ones it was, but they give a former Confederate general and a Union general the command of their forces.
Yeah,
so
I can't remember which ones they were, but yeah.
Because 1898, you're still feeling the effects.
Yeah.
And then
you had 20-year-old, 19-year-old guys serving in the Civil War. I mean, they're 60.
Yeah, that's
something.
Age enough to be able to have
around,
opinions about things. And I would surmise, and I think this is true for pretty much any war, those who actually saw combat are far more likely to be willing to make amends with their former foes, that they would be the ones that you see shaking hands and even embracing at the wall at Gettysburg. Those are some of the most moving pictures you can see.
Yeah.
Especially the moving picture ones where they're moving.
Yeah.
But and then you have, move ahead to World War II, where, Japanese soldiers and, the guys at Pearl Harbor make amends with each other, right? Or Vietnam veterans going back to that country and touring around, and it's so hard for those of us who have never seen combat to imagine that.
Yeah.
But the ones who are not involved are usually the fire and brimstone one.
Right.
Wasn't there a town in Georgia? I forget the name of it. There's a town in Georgia that was settled, and this is the ultimate commemoration of the war, settled intentionally by veterans of both sides.
Oh, interesting.
And they named their streets. Like the center of town was one thing, but each street was named after the different commanders of the armies.
Wow.
And
I've not heard of that. I'm going to have to look that up. That's
so
really fascinating.
It's featured in the book Confederates in the Attic.
Oh, yes.
By Tony Horowitz.
Yes.
And when I lived in Maryland, something more organic happened where the town I lived in was far enough north in Maryland that there was in the town square 2 Civil War plaques and memorials. One for the Union, one for the Confederacy.
Yeah, and Maryland was, man.
But then the further south in Maryland you go, no Union stuff.
Yeah.
Or just Baltimore.
Some really interesting stuff comes out of Maryland, though, because of that. Like, you've got, Confederate things or, secessionists who are still in Maryland, and it's just this hotbed. I mean, and I'm in Cincinnati, which is really close to Kentucky.
Yeah.
And Cincinnati, its involvement was kind of as a staging place. And then we also had John Hunt Morgan's raid, his unsuccessful. It actually goes right by my house. There's little signs that talk about commemoration. I drive.
Any ghosts?
Not that I had come encountered with. He was trying to find this artillery mill, an ammunition mill that was north of the city. And I know where it is. It's a brewery now called Cartridge Brewing.
Makes sense.
Pretty good. It's supposed to be really haunted. But it's hard to find, and he couldn't find it. But it was, this area that had been this major stop on the Underground Railroad because it is right across the river from a slave state.
Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin from there, right?
Yeah, I have a friend who's works at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. It's right there in Cincinnati. We have the Underground Railroad Museum there now. It's a fascinating place. I mean, it was a diverse city, and it's Robert Duncanson was a black painter who was working in Cincinnati too. And one of his famous paintings is a enslaved family who is looking from Kentucky across the river to Cincinnati.
I was gonna say, was that particularly dangerous to be living so close like that? Like, it's not a dynamic you get in Boston.
Yeah.
Even though there's slave catchers in Boston too, but
it was not where a lot of black people stayed. I will say because it was so close. My daughter, she's only 7, but she's learned about how when it's the pre-global warming era, the rivers would freeze, and that's when a lot of
People would,
fugitive slaves would go across to Ohio, but a lot of them would continue north because we were so close to Kentucky.
I think it was there that de Tocqueville on American Democracy makes the observation that on the Kentucky side of the river, it's all gloomy, because it's a slave state and that exists there, and the competition's not there.
Yeah.
You go across to Cincinnati, and it's like the most happening place around. Everybody is moving. And it's like you don't get too many very compare and contrast. I mean, does it still have in present day? Can you tell you're in Kentucky or Ohio when you cross the river, or does it seem pretty much there's an Applebee's on both sides?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think there is a little bit of a difference. And I would say, though, that like Covington and that Newport and that area, just like right on the river, feels much part of Cincinnati. But Cincinnati also feels like a little less of Ohio and more its own independent republic on the river. But it's, going back to the Civil War, it was this place of like troops gathering, and there was an arsenal there, and a lot of troops were trained in these camps around Cincinnati and then went elsewhere. But Kentucky became this battleground state from the very start, and Lincoln, being a Kentucky man, knew that, and he said, we have to keep Kentucky in the Union no matter what. And John Hunt Morgan, going back to him, he actually tried to raid Kentucky in '62, and I've had a broadside once that was like, you guys gotta be loyal to the Confederacy, and it's threatening. It's like, we will burn your houses and we will, do all this. I mean, it's very violent, of saying, join us or else.
Right.
And he was pretty unsuccessful. Turns out people did not want to join somebody burn their house down. But
I imagine, especially those closer to the north, closer to Ohio, had business interests and economic interests as to not go off with this rogue country and see what happens, and they'd rather stay tied. I mean, the same's true with Mississippi River.
Those waterways, the Western Theater was won by like being able to control those waterways, the Mississippi, and opening up the bay. And Ohio is no different, I think, in that regard. But there's an interesting commemorative thing I sold a few years ago that was the businessmen of New York made this big, beautiful document of thanks to Farragut for opening up the Mississippi River, because they're like, you've saved our businesses. You've reopened trade.
Because the system of network of trade
even New York City was very dependent on all of that functioning.
Because the Erie Canal all the way down to the Mississippi was that big network that allowed for them to become. The last thing I'll say, because this has been great.
Rambling.
I hope I didn't make you miss out on lots of deals and stuff with the ephemera stuff. But I was thinking about what we were saying about Baltimore, because like Kentucky, border state, had that kind of.
You see similar things going on, I guess. My connection was why I got on Kentucky in the first place.
Well, there's this great piece of ephemera that I think about, again, nightly with, and I've had my students look at it before when we studied the Civil War, of I forget, it was the 1st Massachusetts, 3rd Massachusetts, the ones that were changing trains in Baltimore, and they got attacked.
Yep, the riots in Baltimore.
On Light Street or whatever, and there's a print, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around what the printer is trying to say with it, but it's essentially, I think they call it the Lexington of 1861.
Yes.
You've seen this one, right? Where
I know exactly what you're talking about,
and it's like, I would say that the better comparison might be more like the Boston Massacre.
Yeah.
Right? Because here are troops who are otherwise minding their business, and the crowd attacks them, and of course they open fire on them because they're being attacked, and it's this whole riot that ensues, and it's very similar to that. But that wouldn't really fit the narrative as closely for Bostonians, which is this image is trying to evoke more revenge feelings from the North than it, just like Fort Sumter, of let's do something about this, so as to put them more, because you would think that, going back to that, we were talking about 4 hours ago with Eleanor about how both sides claimed revolutionary symbology in the war, and it's like the same kind of thing happened with that, where you'd think the Lexington of 1861 would be more of a Southern remark.
Yeah.
Of saying, like, they're here on our territory.
Yeah.
We just repulse them.
Yeah. I feel like there would be an interesting research project to see, especially early war, 61, Fort Sumter, secession, that stuff, of seeing what kind of connections both sides are making to the American Revolution and, like, what battles and what language they're using, because I can't come off with a specific example, but I know I've seen things before of, like, this is our, Lexington Concord, this is our Bunker Hill, this is these connections. There's something interesting to research there, I think.
Go to just go to Concord Bridge in Massachusetts. You can, just like Gettysburg, you can kind of mark because there's a few monuments there, and one of them is the one to the British soldier.
Yeah.
And he came from across the sea, and his relatives killed him and stuff. And then there's the one that I think it was Thoreau or Emerson, one of the Transcendentalists, gave his famous poem to dedicate, and that was at some rando year, like 1852, like had no connection to 1775
dates.
But then the last statue that was put in there was from 1875, and I feel like one of the biggest things that the Civil War did, as far as the way we commemorate the Civil War without realizing we're commemorating the Civil War, is institute this modern idea of everything needs to be recognized in zeros, and it's like whether it be 10 years, 20 years, all the way to 100 years. Because that's what we're doing right now. It's 2025, so it's 250th.
Yeah.
Like, we need to start really focusing on this stuff, even though, honestly, what difference does it make? Well, this is, I think, a great conversation that's going to be definitely, I think, don't you say July 1, 2, 3 would be a good time to put this out? I know we have to wait a little while, but
time to commemorate.
This will be perfect for that. So, Danielle, thank you for all of your time and wonderful insights. This is so much fun to talk to you about this stuff. And as you know me by now, we're best friends at this point. I love Gettysburg and learning about it and getting other people's perspectives about it. And this has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything is a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.